This is going to be a brief overview on how to record and use macros in Microsoft Excel. The first thing that you're going to want to do is make sure that the Developer tab is showing in your ribbon. So if you've never used macros before or recorded macros before, what you'll need to do is go to your Preferences section and then find the Ribbon section and go into the tabs that are showing and make sure that the Developer tab is selected. And this might look a little bit different in different versions of Excel. I'm in Microsoft Excel 2011 for Mac, but it'll be about the same process if you're in a different version or on a PC. And so as you can see, the Developer tab then showed up in our ribbon up here, and we can click into that. And here is where the macros section is. You'll see something that looks like this with macros, maybe editor, VBA editor, and possibly a relative reference button here. So what macros are going to do is they're going to automate processes for you that you maybe been doing manually in the past. And essentially when you're recording a macro, Microsoft Excel is going to take all of the steps or clicks that you've done within your workbook and record it into a macro so that in the future you can just press a button and those exact same steps that you've taken will be automated instead of having to do them manually. So for this example, let's say we pull weekly sales data every week that gets updated, but every week the columns come in and they're the same headers. It's just that all the information below them is different. Now that's important because if we were pulling a spreadsheet every week and the columns were always changing and moving, a macro might not be the best thing because it's gonna do the steps that you've taken in the exact same order, especially when you're recording a simple macro like the one that we're recording. So just keep in mind making sure that the document you're using is in the same format, and that'll be the safest bet. You can learn more about the advanced techniques of VBA and macros online, and there are ways to get around that, but for now I'd just say make sure that it's kind of in the same format when you're using and recording a macro. So let's say we see these headers up here, they're kind of all over the place. We want to maybe move some headers around, we want to sort it by weekly sales data. So what we'll do is we're going to go up and hit record, and then we're going to name our macro. So maybe we'll name this one change headers and sort. You can't have any spaces in this, but you can name it whatever you want. And then you can create a shortcut key and add a description as to what the macro is doing if you need to reference that going forward. So then hit OK, and now that we've done that, Excel is going to now record any of the steps that we take and save it into that macro so that we can automate this process going forward. So maybe what I'll do here is I'll insert a column and cut and paste this employee ID. Maybe we do a lot of VLOOKUPs using this employee ID. We need that in the leftmost column. Maybe we're going to just kind of sort this out so the first name is next to that employee ID, and then the last name, and then let's say we don't even use the pin, so we're just going to delete the pin, delete those extra columns that we've made. Department, last name, maybe we're going to call this weekly sales numbers or whatever. Maybe for some reason we want to add a title to that. And then we want to, let's say that we want to filter and sort by the best sales numbers. So we're going to do descending and click off. So this is our leading salesperson that week, and we want to be able to know that really quickly. Say we don't want that filter on, and that's how we want it to show up once we run the macro. And so I'm going to stop recording, and that's going to have saved all those steps that I've just taken in the macro that I just recorded. And so for this example, I'm just going to undo everything that I just did and show you how the macro is going to automate that process for me. So there we go. We're at the start, and so to run the macro after we've recorded it, we can go up to the section again in our Developer tab that says Macros, and we are going to hit Macros and then hit Run here. And as you can see, it just did all of those manual processes that we just put into the macro automatically for us. So then when we come in here every week, we can just hit the macro where we can run it. It'll sort, it'll do all those things. We filtered and we sorted by descending weekly sales numbers, and it'll do that same thing every week for us automatically. One thing to note is that when you run a macro, you're not able to undo what it just did, as you can see up here. So my recommendation is make sure that you're saving your files, saving a backup, whatever you need to do, just in case something goes wrong when you run the macro or something was off in the data that screwed it up. And just double check after you run the macro that everything looks good. If it doesn't, maybe go back and redo it, or check the raw file or that saved file to make sure that nothing got messed up. So that's recording and running a basic macro. The next thing I want to show you quick is how to record relative macros. So that was what's called an absolute macro, and what that means is that it was when you're recording it, it was seeing like if you deleted column A, it was going to delete column A every time, or if you deleted D4, it's going to delete D4 every time. Well, if you're recording a relative macro, this will make a little more sense once we do it. It's actually going to run the macro based off your starting selected cell location. So based on the cell location that I start with, and then I hit run for the macro, it will run that based on the cell rather than based on the absolute reference of like B2 here. So if I record a macro here, run it, I can then go down and record a macro in B6, run it, and it's going to do the same thing, but it's all going to be relative to this cell rather than doing that same thing again in cell B2. So kind of to show you how that works, so let's say we get, for some reason, another document or Excel spreadsheet every week that kind of looks like this, where it's all kind of wacky, and there's some data that gets pulled here, but as you can see, one of the lines is correct on how we want it to pull in. So it's going to be harder to make an absolute reference macro to manipulate this data how we want it. We're going to probably rather create a relative reference macro and kind of do a little bit more manual work here, but that will make sure that everything is pulling correctly how we want it after we run the macro. So let's say we want to adjust this this section's line so that all this data is being pulled correctly, like down here where it's coherent and in one line as far as the employee's name and whatnot. So what we're going to do is we're going to want to make sure that this relative reference button is selected. Now in some versions of Excel that might not be available. I think Microsoft Excel for Mac 2016 there actually isn't this functionality, but for most other versions you should be able to do it. So it's important that we have that selected before we record our macro to do the relative reference, and now we're going to call this relative format change or something, whatever you want. You can again do a shortcut or a description. We're going to hit OK, and now it's going to be recording our steps based on where our cell is. So you have to know where you have to start this. So in this case, I'm going to want to start it on the last name, so it's selected, and now I'm going to make my manipulations, and it's going to be recording that based on the relative reference to that cell that I have selected. So I'm going to go over here, I'm going to cut the first name, bring it up into this cell. Again, the sales data, we're going to cut that, bring it over into here, sales, paste, the men's department, we'll paste that up here, and then the employee ID number, bring that into this cell, and then we're actually going to delete these empty rows underneath, and that's what we wanted to do for our relative reference macro, and then maybe we'll just have that line actually underneath here selected for the next macro that we're on, or we're just going to leave that cell selected at the end of our macro. So then we click stop, and we'll have that relative reference macro selected. So now I'm going to undo again all those things that I just did, and we're kind of at the start with where our table was, And so again, I'm going to make sure that my cell is selected as far as the relative reference of the data that I'm wanting to manipulate. Go up into macros. This one is called relative format change. We're going to run that. And then as you can see, it made my data exactly how I wanted it here with that name. And it also ended the macro with the next cell below it being highlighted. And so that's really useful because now the relative reference is automatically on that next cell that I want it to be. So if you had it over here, you would then have to, make sure that this last name is selected before you run the macro again. So just kind of a trick that's useful. So then I'm going to come in here again, do the relative format change, run, and then as you can see, even though that data wasn't in the cell that I started with, B2 or whatever it was, it's all relative to where my cursor started out in, and created that successfully for me. So now I want to do it to this cell here, but there's a row up here that's going to be blank, because my relative reference isn't going to delete that because of the way that it worked before, if that makes sense. So you'll see, so again, I want to make sure that the last name is selected for this data, and I'm going to want to go and run this relative format change, and it does it, but there's a blank cell above it, just because it hadn't manipulated any of that in the original macro, but that's okay, and I'll just go and delete this column here. So again, a really quick, easy way to record a macro that can help automate a process. That's the relative reference is, maybe with some data that's not quite as unified as the first reference with the absolute data, where we were just manipulating the columns that stayed the same every week. So there's a lot more tutorials and in-depth information online about macros and how to use them, and some advanced features on what you can do. But that's just kind of a brief overview on a really simple, basic macros that you can record and use to help make Excel more efficient.